The coin was cold. Caleb Harrow stood in the middle of Duskwell's main street and felt the weight of 20 silver dollars
Here
pressed
is what
into
we
his
agreed
palm by
upon.
his younger brother's
It
hand.
seems fair. I
Around
accept.
him, the town went about its morning. A wagon rolled past. A woman swept her porch. Two men outside the feed store paused their conversation to watch. They were all watching. Virgil Harrow stood across from him, hat in hand, his face arranged
So then he
into
says,
an
"That ain't
expression
a
that was meant
raccoon?"
to look like
What was
grief,
it?
but landed
Let me
closer
guess.
to inconvenience.
His wife.
He was 12 years younger than Caleb, softer in the jaw, quicker with words. He had always been quicker with words. "It's all that's left," Virgil said. "After the back taxes, after the surveyor's fee, after the legal costs. I tried, Caleb. I genuinely tried." Caleb looked at the coins. He didn't count them. Virgil kept talking. He always did when silence made him uncomfortable. Something about the land being worthless anyway. Something about rocky soil and failed claims, and how May, God rest her, would have understood. How May always understood practical decisions. Caleb closed his fingers around the coins. He didn't look at his brother. He didn't look at the watching faces along the street. He put the money in his coat pocket, turned west, and walked. Behind him, he heard Virgil exhale, relief dressed up as sorrow. Caleb kept walking. The saloon at the far end of Duskwell's main street was called the Meridian, a name too grand for what it actually was, a low-ceilinged room with sawdust floors and 4 tables that leaned at different angles, like men who'd had too much to drink. Caleb had not planned to go inside, but his legs carried him there, and he didn't argue with them. He ordered whiskey, 1 glass. He set it on the bar and looked at it for a moment before drinking. At the table behind him, 2 men were talking in the easy, unguarded way of men who believe themselves unheard. One of them had a new hat. The other had the particular satisfied look of someone who had recently gotten more than he expected. Caleb was not trying to listen, but some words cut through a room whether you want them to or not. "Told you the water made it worth more than they knew." Virgil didn't push back at all, practically handed it over. "For what we paid, that spring alone will..." Caleb set his glass down. He picked it back up. He drank slowly. He breathed through his nose. The men kept talking. Numbers floated past him. The number they had paid Virgil. The number they expected to make from the water rights alone within 2 years. The number made the 20 silver dollars in Caleb's pocket feel like something obscene, not just inadequate, but deliberate. A calculated insult dressed up as charity. Virgil had not been desperate. Virgil had been paid. Caleb set his empty glass on the bar with a gentleness that required everything he had. He nodded at the bartender. He walked back out into the morning light. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let the cold air work on him. He thought about what he knew, which was this. The deed to that land had been held jointly, his name and May's together, the way they had held everything in 31 years of marriage. Joint title. When May died, her share did not pass to Virgil. It had never been Virgil's to assign, to sign, or to sell. Whatever papers Virgil had presented to those 2 satisfied men in the Meridian, whatever they had paid and whatever they believed they had purchased, the transaction was built on ground that would not hold. A lawyer would have seen it in 5 minutes. Caleb was not a lawyer. He had spent 40 years underground reading what the earth would give and what it intended to keep, and he understood the difference between solid rock and something dressed up to look like it. What Virgil had sold was a convincing imitation of a thing he did not own, which meant the land was still Caleb's, which meant he knew where he was going. He did not go back to find his brother. There was nothing to say that his hands wouldn't say first, and Caleb Harrow had not come this far in life to end it in a street fight over money that was already gone. Instead, he turned west, and this time he didn't stop. May had found the land first. That was the truth of it, the thing Caleb returned to as his boots found the old wagon road west of town. It had been 8 years ago, maybe 9. They had ridden out together on a Sunday afternoon, no particular destination, just the kind of aimless riding that married people do when they're comfortable enough with silence to share it. May had been on a roan mare she called Patience, for reasons she never fully explained, but that Caleb suspected had something to do with him. She had pulled up at the edge of a ridge and looked down at the land below. 300 acres of scrub and rock and red earth nothing, crowned by the enormous carcass of a fallen cottonwood tree whose roots had torn a great wound in the hillside when it came down. That one, she said. Caleb had looked at it. He saw what everyone saw. Worthless ground, rock too close to the surface for planting, timber already dead and drying, the kind of claim that sold cheap because no one wanted it. May, that one, Caleb. He had learned over 31 years of marriage that there were two kinds of things May said, things she said to discuss, and things she said to inform him of what was already decided. This was the second kind. They bought it the following spring, 300 acres for less than the price of a decent horse. Caleb had looked at the deed and thought it felt like holding a piece of paper that had been soaked in regret. May had folded it carefully and tucked it into the cedar box where she kept things that mattered. He never asked her why. He meant to. The years have a way of absorbing intentions. May died in October of 1885, a fever that came fast and left nothing to negotiate with. She was 57 years old. She had been tending her kitchen garden when the first symptoms hit, and the last coherent thing she said to Caleb, though he didn't know it was the last at the time, was that the turnips needed another week. He had given them another week. He had harvested them alone. He had eaten them through the winter, one at a time, making them last longer than turnips needed to last. He was not sure why. He was not sure of many things in the 2 years that followed. What he was sure of was this: the land was hers. Whatever else had happened, whatever Virgil had signed and sold and pocketed, the land had been May's idea, May's faith, May's insistence on a Sunday afternoon when she pulled up on her own mare and said that one as though the matter had already been settled by someone with better information than either of them. And now his legs were carrying him there. It was 6 miles from Duskwell to the western claim, and Caleb walked all of it before noon. The town fell away behind him. The road thinned to a track, then to suggestion, then to nothing. The land around him opened up into the high Colorado scrubland, juniper and pinon pine, red rock shelves jutting through the thin soil, hawks riding the thermals so high above they looked like punctuation marks against the pale sky. He had spent 40 years working underground, 30 years in the silver mines of Colorado, then 10 more consulting for smaller operations, reading rock the way other men read newspapers. He knew what the earth looked like from the inside. He knew the language of stone and soil, the difference between ground that wanted to give and ground that intended to hold forever. Most men feared what was underground. Caleb had never been most men. He crested the last ridge as the sun reached its highest point, and there it was below him. The fallen cottonwood was larger than he remembered. In his memory, it had been impressive. In person, after 2 years of drying and settling, it was something else entirely. A cathedral of dead wood, the trunk as thick as a man was tall, the root ball torn from the earth and frozen mid-reach, a tangle of massive exposed roots like the fingers of a buried giant. Where those roots had ripped free, they had left a deep natural hollow in the hillside, a wound in the earth 15 feet across and dropping down into shadow. Caleb stood at the rim and looked down into it. He had been a miner. He knew what a good hollow was worth. He climbed down. The bottom of the hollow was soft with old leaf matter and the particular damp smell of ground that never quite saw the sun. The walls were earthen on 3 sides, reinforced by a shelf of gray limestone that jutted out at shoulder height. Above, the enormous fallen trunk stretched across the opening like a beam put there by intention, its massive girth blocking wind, its dead wood dense and hard after years of slow drying. Caleb stood in the hollow and looked up at the trunk above him. He put his hand on the earthen wall. He pressed his palm flat against it and felt the cool, solid resistance of clay-heavy soil. A miner knew this. Clay held. Clay didn't crumble. Clay, properly understood, was architecture. He had carried tools with him from the wagon barn he'd kept on the edge of Duskwell. A miner's spade, a pickaxe, 2 lengths of rope, a canvas sack, a tin of hardtack, a small bag of dried meat. Everything else he owned had gone with Virgil's accounting of debts and costs and fees, or was still in the house on Alderman Street that he would need to vacate by the end of the month. He had left the house that morning before dawn. He had not gone back. Caleb set his pack against the clay wall and took out the spade. He picked his spot, the deepest corner of the hollow under the thickest section of trunk, where the natural roof was highest and most solid. He set his boot against the blade. He drove it down. The first hour taught him what he had forgotten. His body remembered the work. The angle of the wrists, the torque of the lower back, the way you had to set your weight before each push to get maximum depth. But his body also remembered that it was 61 years old, and that there was a difference between memory and capability. The spade hit clay at 8 inches. True clay, dense and red as an old wound. The kind that fought you. He fought back. Blisters came within the hour, rose and broke, and the handle of the spade was slicked with blood before he thought to stop and wrap his hands with strips torn from a spare shirt. He dug. The rhythm was brutal and simple. Drive the blade, pry loose a chunk, scoop it into the canvas sack, carry the sack to the rim, dump it, drive the blade, pry, scoop, carry, dump. The sun moved across the sky above the fallen trunk. Shadows shifted. Caleb Harrow dug. He was not thinking about Virgil. He was not thinking about the saloon, or the two men with their satisfied voices, or the number that separated what he was given from what was taken. He was not thinking about the house on Alderman Street, or the Sutter box still sitting on May's side of the bedroom, or the 31 years of a life that had narrowed, in 2 years, to a single room where he ate alone and slept badly and woke each morning slightly surprised to still be there. He was thinking about clay. He was thinking about depth. He was thinking about the angle of the root ball above him and whether it would hold if the soil beneath it shifted. Miners think in terms of what might kill them. It keeps them precise. By mid-afternoon, the hollow had deepened by 2 feet in the main section. Caleb's arms were burning from shoulder to fingertip. His back had opinions about everything he was doing, and none of them were polite. He sat on the edge of the pit and drank from his canteen and looked at what he had made. It wasn't much. It was a start. He had no plan beyond the next 6 inches of earth. He had no vision beyond surviving the night in a place that didn't belong to anyone else. He was 61 years old, his hands were bleeding, and his back was discussing a formal complaint. He had $20 in his pocket and a miner's spade, and 40 years of knowing what the ground would give if you asked it right. He picked up the spade. He went back to work. He lit a fire that first night using deadwood broken from the lower branches of the fallen cottonwood. The fire was small, set in a depression he'd scraped out of the earth at the back of the hollow, drawing the smoke up through the gap between the root ball and the rock shelf above. It wasn't a chimney. It was an accident of geology that he was borrowing. But it worked well enough. He ate hardtack and dried meat and drank half his remaining water and sat with his back against the clay wall, watching the fire. The wind was picking up outside. He could hear it moving through the scrub, a low, continuous sound like something trying to get in. Above him, the dead wood of the cottonwood trunk creaked once, deeply, the sound of old timber settling into the permanence of its final position. Then it was quiet again. He thought about May, not in the way he thought about her in the house on Alderman Street, where her absence had a specific geography. The empty chair, the side of the bed that stayed flat, the kitchen that had slowly reorganized itself around one person without his permission. Out here, with the earth at his back and the fire's warmth pushing against the cold, the thinking was different, quieter, more like a conversation with something that wasn't quite gone. May had seen something in this land that no one else had seen. She had pulled up on Patience and said that one, and she had been right, and he had never asked her why. He had meant to. The years had taken the question away before he could ask it. He wondered now what she had known that he hadn't. The fire burned down to coals. He did not rebuild it. He lay on the ground with his canvas pulled over him and listened to the wind working at the edges of the hollow, testing the seal of this small earthen room, and he thought, it holds. The wind is out there and I am in here, and between us is this wall of clay that I put my hands against this morning and felt hold. Sleep came slowly and left before dawn, which was about what he expected. On the second morning, digging deeper into the back corner of the hollow, his spade hit something that wasn't clay. He thought at first it was rock, a buried shelf of limestone, common enough in this ground. He worked around the edges of it carefully, the way a miner does, respecting what he doesn't know yet. But limestone had a sound when struck, a flat thunk of dense mineral. This had a different sound, duller, hollower. He cleared the clay away from the edges with his hands. It was a tin box, roughly the size of a large book, sealed with a simple latch, the metal dark with soil but not deeply rusted. Someone had wrapped it in oilcloth before burying it, which meant someone had wanted what was inside to last. Caleb sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. He knew May's handwriting before he opened the box. It was on a folded piece of paper tucked under the oilcloth, the letters careful and deliberate in the way of a woman who had taught herself to write in her 30s and never stopped being precise about it. For the day someone digs here. M.H. He opened the box. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavier paper, the kind used for surveying documents. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it against his knee. It was a hand-drawn map, May's hand, unmistakable. It showed the 300 acres from above, with landmarks he recognized. The ridgeline, the fallen cottonwood marked with a small, careful sketch, the rock outcroppings to the north. But the map also showed something else, a series of dotted lines running beneath the surface, converging at a point roughly 40 yards southeast of where he was sitting now. At the convergence point, May had written 2 words, water, deep. And beneath that, in smaller letters, don't let them tell you this land is nothing. Caleb sat in the hollow he had dug with his own 2 hands, holding his dead wife's map in his bleeding hands, and he did not speak. There was no one to speak to. The fire had burned down to coals, and the wind moved through the scrub outside, and somewhere above him, the old cottonwood creaked in its final resting place. May had known. She had come out here alone, he understood now, remembering the Sundays she'd said she was riding. Just riding, which he had believed because May had always been a rider. And she had surveyed this land herself, or paid someone quiet to do it, and she had found water beneath rock and clay and 300 acres of nothing. She had buried the knowledge here, in a box, under the ground of the only land she'd ever owned. She hadn't told him because she knew him. She knew that he would have worried it into a plan, and plans could be heard, and heard plans had a way of attracting Virgil's. She hadn't told Virgil because she had understood Virgil far better than Virgil had ever suspected, and she had known what he would do with the information. She had trusted the earth to keep the secret until it was needed, and she had trusted that whoever dug here would be someone who deserved to find it. Not assumed. Trusted. There was a difference, and it was the difference between faith and calculation, and May had always known which one held longer. Caleb folded the map carefully and put it in his coat pocket against his chest. Then he picked up his spade and started digging again. 5 days into the work, he made the walk to Duskwell. His supplies were running low, and there were things he needed that could not be improvised from clay and dead wood. He wore his cleanest shirt and his better boots and walked the 6 miles with the particular gait of a man who is tired but will not show it to anyone. Duskwell in the morning was a town going about its practical business, the way frontier towns did. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply occupied with itself. He had lived on the edge of this town for 11 years, long enough to know the faces but not so long that his leaving would have disturbed the surface much. He had been May's husband, and then he had been the widower on Alderman Street, and those were the only categories this town had for him. He pushed open the door of Pruitt's Mercantile. The bell above the door was the cheerful sound of commerce, indifferent to the state of any man who entered. Cormac Pruitt was behind the counter, a lean man in his early 60s with a face like weathered fence board. Not mean, but not given to unnecessary expression either. He wore spectacles low on his nose and had the habit of reading what was in front of him before he looked up, as if finishing the thought was more important than rushing to acknowledge company. He finished his thought. He looked up. "Harrow," he said. "Pruitt." That was, in its entirety, the greeting. Caleb put his list on the counter. Pruitt read it without touching it, his eyes moving down the items with the speed of a man who knew his inventory by memory. Salt, 100 feet of heavy-gauge wire, a new spade head, 3 candles, a small lantern with oil, a length of canvas, 12 feet. Pruitt's eyes stopped on the wire. "That's rough ground your wife favored," he said. His voice was dry as the county in August. It was not a question. It was an observation, offered without pity, which Caleb appreciated more than he could have explained. "It has its uses," Caleb said. Something shifted in Pruitt's expression. Not warmth. Warmth was not a thing Pruitt trafficked in, as far as Caleb could tell, but something adjacent to it. The look a man gives another man when the second man has said the correct thing without being told what the correct thing was. Pruitt gathered the items without further commentary. He wrapped them in brown paper. He wrote the total on a slip and slid it across the counter. $4.70, a significant portion of what Caleb had. He counted it out without flinching, because there was no benefit in flinching, and because Pruitt was not the kind of man who respected the performance of hardship. He loaded the supplies into his pack. At the door, he paused. Pruitt, the older man looked up. Virgil sold that land for what? A pause, but Pruitt took off his spectacles, polished them on his apron with the slow deliberateness of a man deciding how much truth a situation required. 4 times what he gave you, Pruitt said. Near enough. Caleb nodded once. Title was joint, Caleb said. Mine and May's. He didn't have the right. Pruitt put his spectacles back on. He looked at Caleb steadily. No, he said. He didn't. The two men regarded each other for a moment in the particular way of men who understand something has been established between them without needing to name what it is. Caleb walked out into the morning. He was 2 miles west of Duskwell on the narrowing track that led out toward the claim when he first noticed the dog. It was keeping pace with him at a distance of about 30 yards, close enough to observe, far enough to retreat. A medium-sized animal, reddish-brown in color, built for endurance rather than speed. Its ribs were visible even at this distance, its coat matted with months of outdoor living. It moved with the careful, economic gait of an animal that had learned that every step needed to be worth the energy it cost. Caleb didn't stop or turn. He kept walking. The dog kept pace. At the next mile marker, a cairn of stones someone had built beside the track years ago for reasons no one remembered, Caleb stopped and took a strip of dried meat from his pack. He set it on top of the cairn stones without looking at the dog, shouldered his pack, and kept walking. He heard the soft sound of paws behind him, then the brief pause of an animal approaching something uncertain, then quiet. When he looked back a quarter mile later, the dog was eating. He turned west and kept going. The dog arrived at the hollow as the sun was setting, appearing at the rim without ceremony, sitting down and watching Caleb work with the patient attention of an animal that has made a decision and is waiting for the other party to catch up. Caleb looked at it. It looked at him. It was a male, he could see now, young enough to still have some softness around the eyes, old enough to have lost most of the puppy's trust in the world. He was the particular rust-red color of the clay Caleb had been digging in all day. Not a planned irony, just the kind of coincidence that the world occasionally offered without explanation. Caleb took out the last strip of dried meat from his pack. He tore it in half. He tossed one half up to the rim. The dog took it from the air with a precision that suggested it had been hungry for long enough that it had become excellent at catching things. It sat back down and watched. That's all there is tonight, Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he expected, the first words he'd spoken aloud in 5 days, and his throat had apparently filed a complaint about the disuse. Don't get comfortable. The dog lay down at the rim, chin on paws, watching him with dark, steady eyes. By the time Caleb had banked the fire and rolled himself in his canvas and closed his eyes against the cold and the dark in the particular silence of a man who has no one left to account to, the dog had moved down into the hollow and settled near his feet. It didn't bark. It didn't whine. It simply existed, warm and present, a small, steady weight against the cold. Caleb lay still and stared at the underside of the old cottonwood trunk above him, 300 acres of nothing stretching out in every direction, a dead woman's map folded against his chest, $20 minus 4 and change in his pocket, and a stray dog he hadn't invited settling in like it had always been there. He named it Rust because of the color and because of the way certain things come back to usefulness long after you've assumed they're finished. He did not sleep well. But for the first time in 2 years, he did not sleep entirely alone. He would dig in the morning. He would keep digging until the ground gave him something, or until he gave out first. He was 61 years old and his hands were wrapped in cloth and his back had formally resigned its cooperation, and none of that changed what the morning would require. May had seen something in this ground. He was going to find out what. The third week was different from the first two, in the way that all real work eventually becomes different from its beginning. Not easier, but more organized, the body having accepted the terms and begun to optimize within them. The blisters had hardened into calluses. The morning stiffness still came, but it peaked earlier and released faster. His hands knew the spade the way they had once known a drill handle underground, which was to say they moved without consulting him, which was the definition of competence in physical work. The hollow was taking shape in a way that had begun to feel intentional rather than desperate. He had extended the main chamber to roughly 10 feet by 12, the ceiling formed by the massive cottonwood trunk above, 8 feet of ancient wood, hard as iron from years of slow drying. He lined the lower walls with flat stones pulled from the hillside, setting them without mortar in the dry stack method he'd learned in narrow mine quarters, where the work of keeping the walls up was never finished. The technique was different here. Underground, you stacked to prevent collapse inward. Here you stacked to prevent the erosion of your own making. But the underlying principle was identical. Weight distributed evenly, pressure redirected, stone holding earth. He had improved the fire pit in those first days, working at the natural fissure in the limestone shelf at the rear of the hollow with the pickaxe, clearing it methodically of debris and loose rock, following it upward until he found where it opened to the surface 6 feet above. It was not a chimney anyone would have designed, but smoke rose through it, and cold air did not descend through it, and that was the functional definition of success in a place where no architect had preceded him. The first real fire in the improved pit burned hot and clean. The stone walls held the heat long after the fire was banked to coals, radiating it back through the night. Caleb lay on his bed of pine boughs and felt the warmth against his back and thought, this can work. This can actually work. Russ lay near his feet and offered no contradiction. The day settled into a rhythm that had the quality of something almost peaceful, if peace could coexist with the constant exhaustion of heavy physical labor performed by a 61-year-old body that had opinions about everything. He woke before the sun. He coaxed the coals back to flame. He ate sparingly from his diminishing stores. He worked. In the evenings, he sat at the entrance of the hollow and watched the Colorado sky perform its nightly transformation. The blue deepening through stages he had begun to catalog the way he had once cataloged rock strata, each layer distinct, each carrying information about what lay above and below it. The stars came out over the scrubland in the particular abundance that was only possible this far from town, this far from any competing light. He had not been a man given to noticing the sky. Underground there was no sky. You worked by lamplight and you thought about the rock, and you went home, and you slept, and you went back underground. May had been the one who noticed the sky. She had a habit of stopping whatever she was doing at dusk and simply looking up, as though the day required that acknowledgement before it could properly end. He found himself doing it now. He was not sure what that meant. He thought it probably meant something. He thought May would have had something to say about it, dry and accurate, delivered without sentimentality, which was the only way she delivered anything. He couldn't hear the specific words, but he could feel the shape of them, somewhere in the vicinity of his chest, the way you feel the shape of a room you know well, even in total darkness. He kept digging, he kept the fire, he watched the stars. And slowly, in the way of things that happen without announcement, the hollow became less a hole and more a home. The water system came from watching the rain. There was not much rain in the first weeks, a brief afternoon shower that left the ground smelling like copper and dried before it could accomplish anything useful. But what little there was showed him things. He watched where the water went. He watched which surfaces shed it and which absorbed it, where it pooled and where it ran, and where it disappeared into cracks in the limestone that might lead somewhere worth following. There was a natural fissure in the rock face directly behind the root ball, roughly 20 yards uphill from the hollow. Every rainfall sent a stream of water cascading down it, following the rock face, pooling briefly in a natural depression at the base before dispersing into the clay, with the wastefulness of something that didn't know its own value. The water was clean. It came from deep in the hill, filtered through limestone over a distance he couldn't calculate. Cold and clear, in a way that spoke of depth and age. It was going to waste. Caleb spent 2 days with the pickaxe and the spade, cutting a narrow channel from that natural depression down to a pit he dug 40 yards from the hollow entrance, far enough that overflow would not threaten the shelter, close enough to be practical. He lined the channel with flat stones, each one selected for its flatness and set in the direction of flow. He lined the pit with clay, pounding it smooth and dense with a flat rock used as a ram, going over and over the same surface until the clay was nearly impermeable. The way potters made vessels. The same principle applied to a larger and less elegant purpose. The next rain, a harder one, 3 days after the channel was finished, filled the pit in 4 hours. He drank from it the following morning, cupping the water in his palms. It was cold enough to ache in his back teeth. It tasted of limestone and distance, the taste of water that had been underground a long time and carried the memory of it. May's map was still folded against his chest. The water it promised was deeper and more permanent than this, the kind that didn't depend on rainfall, but came from somewhere so far below that the seasons couldn't reach it. He hadn't found it yet. The dotted lines on the map pointed southeast, and he had walked the ground in that direction twice now, reading the surface for the signs May might have read from horseback. The subtle depressions that indicated subsurface flow, the particular vegetation that followed underground water even when the surface was dry, the way limestone fractured in patterns that betrayed what moved through it. He had not found it yet, but he had water for now, and now was what the morning required. The deeper water would come when it came. May had been patient about it for 8 years. He could afford to be patient. The wire Pruitt had sold him was for snares. Caleb had learned trapping from a man named Tobias, a Ute who had worked the same silver mine as Caleb for 3 seasons in the 1860s, before the silver thinned and the operation closed, and Tobias went back to his people while Caleb went deeper into other rock. Tobias had taught him things underground in the way men taught each other useful things in close quarters and shared danger. Not formally, not with instruction, but by demonstration, patient and wordless, until the other man's hands knew the shape without needing to be told. The snare was one of those things, a specific geometry of wire and tension and trigger, set at exactly the right height on exactly the right kind of trail, that transformed patience into meat. Tobias had shown him once. Caleb had never forgotten. He set 8 snares along the game trails he had mapped in his first 2 weeks on the land. He could read trails the way he read rock strata, by the pressure marks left in soft ground, the hair caught on bark at specific heights, the particular way vegetation bent in the direction of regular passage. Rabbit sign was everywhere. Deer less often, but their trails were clear, the hoof prints pressed deep in soft ground near the water channel, where they came to drink in the gray hours before dawn. For 4 days, the snares held nothing. On the morning of the 5th day, walking his line in the pre-dawn gray with Rust ranging ahead and behind like a scout who had finally found appropriate employment, he found a rabbit in the 3rd snare. It was a large one, heavy and well-fed on late summer grasses. He killed it cleanly, the way Tobias had shown him, a single precise motion that left no room for hesitation and no reason for it. The skin he set aside. He had no curing supplies yet, but he stretched it over a frame of bent willow branches and set it to dry in the sun with the patience of a man who has learned that nothing is wasted if you can figure out what it is. He cooked the meat over the fire pit that evening, and the smell that rose from the hollow and drifted out into the cooling air of the Colorado evening was the smell of something that might generously be called a life beginning to organize itself around its own logic. Rust received the bones with the focused dignity of an animal that has decided to stay and is now simply waiting for the human to arrive at the same decision. It was the clay that opened the next door. He had been excavating it for weeks, hauling it out of the hollow in canvas sacks, dumping it in growing mounds 30 yards away, building up a ridge of excavated earth that he was slowly recognizing could serve as a windbreak if he shaped it correctly. The clay was a nuisance. Dense and heavy and sticky when wet, it dragged on the spade and clung to his boots and dried on his hands in a way that cracked the skin around his knuckles in patterns that reminded him, obscurely, of dry creek beds. But it dried hard. He had noticed that early on, how a lump of clay left in the sun for a full day came back almost solid, requiring real force to break. A miner noticed things like structural properties because structural properties were survival information. The difference between a wall that held and one that didn't. But it was an afternoon of frustration with 2 failed snares. The wire badly looped, the trigger set wrong, basic errors he should not have been making, that pushed the observation into the territory of an idea. He had worked with bricks, not made them, but used them, in the construction of mine ventilation shafts where the heat requirements demanded something more durable than timber. He knew roughly what a brick was: clay, shaped and fired at sufficient temperature, the heat driving out the water and locking the mineral structure into something permanent. The chemistry was more complex than that summary suggested, but the principle was simple enough for a man without a kiln or a ceramics background to attempt. He had clay. He had fire. He tried. His first attempts were instructive in the way of failures that cost you something real. He formed 12 blocks by hand, each roughly the size of his doubled fist, pressed dense, and set them in the sun to dry for 2 days. They cracked as the moisture escaped unevenly, the surface hardening before the interior could follow, stress fractures opening through them like bad news delivered in stages. He tried wetting the clay less before forming. They cracked faster. He tried wetting it more. They slumped and lost their edges. He tried mixing in dried grass from the hillside the way he had a vague impression of having seen done somewhere. A settlement years ago, the memory more impression than specific detail. The bricks held their shape better but came out brittle, crumbling at the struck edges in a way that was worse than cracking, because cracking at least implied some structural coherence. He built a small, enclosed fire around a batch, stacking the bricks against the heat. They blackened and split with sharp sounds like small caliber shots, each one a precise notification of failure delivered at irregular intervals through the night. He sat with his back against the clay wall for a long time after the last one cracked. Russ put his chin on Caleb's knee. Caleb looked at the fragments spread across the ground in front of the hollow entrance. He looked at them the way he had learned to look at failed rock faces underground, not with frustration, because frustration closed your thinking, but with the specific open attention of a man trying to understand what the material was telling him about itself. Then he picked up his pickaxe and went to the back of the hollow, to the section of wall he had been slowly widening, and he struck the rock face with more force than the work strictly required. A section of limestone broke away. He looked at it. It was a different texture than the shelf above, softer, more granular, almost chalky where it had fractured. He picked up a piece and ran his thumb across the broken face. It left a fine white powder on his skin. He stood very still for a moment. In the mines, they had used limestone dust in the ventilation shafts, not for structure, but for chemistry. Limestone dust mixed with water created a reaction. Mixed into certain materials under heat, it changed how those materials behaved. The old-timers had called the product quicklime, though the full process was considerably more complex than that name implied. What Caleb knew from 40 years underground, where understanding the chemistry of your environment was the difference between breathing and not, was that limestone powder introduced into clay changed the clay's behavior under heat in ways that simple clay alone did not achieve. He spent a full day reducing the soft limestone to fine powder, using a heavy river stone as a pestle against a flat slab of harder rock. The work was different from digging. A smaller motion, more repetitive, burning in the forearms rather than the shoulders, the kind of ache that accumulated without mercy. He mixed a measured amount of the powder into a batch of wet clay. He kneaded it with his hands until the mixture was uniform throughout. The white powder fully incorporated into the red clay, neither material any longer entirely itself. He formed 6 bricks. They looked like every brick he had failed to make. He built a small enclosed structure against the sheer rock face using loose stones. A rough kiln, 2 feet square, the simplest possible version of the thing. He placed the 6 bricks inside. He built a slow fire beneath them, feeding it carefully, and sealed the front with flat stones, leaving calibrated gaps for the air the combustion required. He kept the fire for 2 full days, feeding it at intervals, maintaining the temperature as steadily as he could judge by the color of the smoke and the sound the fire made inside the sealed chamber. The dead cottonwood burned long and hot. Another gift from the tree, added to the list that already included a roof and a hiding place for a dead woman's secrets. He told himself during those 2 days of waiting that if these failed, he would think of something else. He had always thought of something else. That capacity, the refusal to accept the current failure as the final condition, was the only skill that had actually mattered in 40 years underground, and he saw no reason it would fail him now. On the 3rd morning, he let the kiln cool completely before he touched it. Then he dismantled the front stones one at a time, carefully, the way you approached any sealed space after a fire. The bricks were warped. They were uneven, their surfaces lumpy and discolored, streaked with the gray-white of the limestone compound. They were, by any measure a brickmaker would recognize as professional, ugly. He picked one up. It was heavier than he expected, the weight of something that had become more than what it started as. He tapped it with the handle of his pickaxe. It rang. Not the dull thud of unfired clay, not the hollow sound of something that was going to break at the first real test. A ring, clean, hard, the sound of mineral locked by heat into permanent structure, the sound of material that had passed through fire and come out the other side as something different from what it had been going in. He struck it harder. It did not break. He set it against a rock and hit it with the flat of the pickaxe head, a blow that would have reduced any of his previous attempts to powder and remorse. The brick cracked, one clean line, not an explosion. He picked up both halves. The interior was dense and gray, fully fired through, no soft center where the heat hadn't reached. He sat back and looked at his hands. They were white with limestone dust, cracked along every knuckle. The blisters of the first weeks now replaced by calluses that had their own topography. They were 61-year-old hands that had spent 4 decades underground and were now, apparently, in the business of making something that would last above ground. Caleb loaded 5 of the 6 bricks into a canvas sack. He kept one to look at, setting it on the flat stone inside the hollow entrance where the light hit it at the right angle to show the fired surface clearly. He walked to Duskwell. He set the bricks on Pruitt's counter without preamble. Pruitt looked at them. He picked one up, weighed it in his hand with the slow assessment of a man who had handled a great many things over a great many years and had developed an opinion about all of them. He said nothing for a moment. Then he produced a small hammer from beneath the counter and gave the brick a sharp strike. The brick did not break. Pruitt set it down. He picked up another. He struck that one too. "Ugly," he said. "Strong," Caleb said. A pause that had the quality of a transaction being calculated. "Good for hearths," Pruitt said. "Fireboxes. I had a man in here last week complaining his firebox was crumbling out. Nobody in the territory making anything worth putting in a firebox." He turned the brick over, examining the fired surface with the attention he gave to merchandise he was considering. 10 cents each, 50 cents for 5 bricks. It was not a fortune. It was not even a reasonable wage for the work that had gone into it if you counted the failed attempts and the days spent grinding limestone. But it was income generated entirely from the materials of this land: clay dug by hand, limestone ground to powder with a river stone, wood from a tree that had been waiting years to be useful. He had made it from what the ground offered and sold it for money, and the distance between those two conditions was the only distance that mattered in a world that ran on the former, producing the latter. "I'll have more," Caleb said. Pruitt nodded. The conversation was, by mutual unspoken agreement, complete. Caleb walked back out into the Colorado morning with 50 cents in his pocket and something harder to name settling into his chest like a stone finding its level. He was not just surviving, he was producing. The sabotage came without warning, the way cowardly things always do. He walked out one morning in mid-October to find his primary clay pit, the one he had spent 3 weeks developing, with the purest deposit and the most accessible face, filled to the brim with cattle dung. Not an accident of proximity to a pasture, not overflow from a wet season. It had been shoveled in deliberately, layer by patient layer, someone working in the dark with sufficient determination to be thorough, which was the worst kind of enemy, the patient kind. He stood at the edge of it for a long time. Russ stood beside him, nose working the air, reading information that Caleb's inferior senses couldn't access. The full snare line came next. He found it on the same morning. All 8 snares, every one. The wire cut cleanly, not broken by an animal or worn through by weather or time. Cut with something sharp by someone who had walked the entire line with knowledge of where each snare was set and had done each one deliberately and without haste. The wooden toggles smashed. The bent willow frames he'd used for drying the rabbit skin were kicked apart. The violation of it was what he hadn't expected. He had prepared himself in the general way of a man who has lived long enough to know that hardship multiplies. For weather and injury and bad luck in the simple physical punishment of old work done by aging bones. He had not prepared for this. Someone walking his land in the dark, methodically dismantling what he had built, piece by piece with the focused attention of someone who needed him to know it was personal. He felt the rage come up. It was a cold rage, not a hot one. He had always run cold when he was truly angry, which people sometimes mistook for calm, and which was, in a technical sense, a form of it, though not the comfortable kind. He stood at the ruined snare line and let the cold move through him, and then he set it aside the way you set aside a tool you don't currently need, because rage was not useful information and he had work to do. Useful information was who and why and what to do with that knowledge. He worked the problem the way he had worked geological problems underground, methodically without assumption, following the evidence where it led rather than where he expected it to go. He walked the perimeter of his claim, reading the ground. He found tracks in the soft earth near the clay pit, boot prints, a man's, medium-sized, with a worn heel on the right side that left a distinctive shallow mark. He found where a horse had been tied to a juniper about a quarter-mile east, the bark rubbed raw, the ground churned by the patient movement of an animal kept waiting longer than it preferred. He followed the horse tracks east along the ridge. They led to the fence line of the Silas Webb property. Webb was a homesteader who had been working this valley 3 years longer than Caleb's claim existed. He ran cattle on land that wasn't quite good enough for the cattle and grew winter wheat on ground that wasn't quite right for the wheat, and he had the particular disposition of a man who had expected considerably more from life than life had been prepared to deliver. Caleb knew him the way you knew men in country, where the distances between properties were measured in miles, by sight, by reputation, by the accumulated impression of brief and infrequent encounters. He also knew from something Pruitt had mentioned without particular emphasis during a supply visit 2 weeks earlier that Webb's wife had recently purchased a dozen of Caleb's bricks from Pruitt's store to repair her kitchen firebox, rather than waiting for her husband to get around to building something himself. The motive was that small. A man's wife had chosen someone else's work over his, that was all. That was the entire reason the clay pit was ruined and the snares were cut, and Caleb had lost 2 days of production and a week's worth of trapping. He stood at Webb's fence line and looked at the house a quarter-mile away, smoke rising from its chimney in the cold morning air, and he thought about the hour-long walk to that house and what Webb would say and how Webb would deny it and what Caleb could prove and what proving it would accomplish in a territory where disputes between men ended in ways that were generally bad and sometimes permanent. He turned around. He walked back to the hollow. He spent 2 full days digging the dung out of his primary clay pit, hauling it away in canvas sacks, the work as unpleasant as any 40 years underground had required him to do, which was a meaningful comparison. Then he spent 3 days prospecting the hillside systematically, testing the soil at 6-inch intervals with the spade, working east and then south through country he hadn't examined closely before. He found a second clay deposit, deeper and richer than the first, hidden behind a thicket of scrub oak that made it invisible from any common path or fence line. The clay here was darker and more consistent, fewer rocks and less variation in composition. It was better than what he'd had before. He built a new snare line on game trails he had not previously used, further from any track and further from Webb's fence line, each snare set with more care and more concealment than the last. He had learned from Tobias to read the trails, but he had not originally applied that knowledge to the question of which trails were visible to anyone who happened to be paying attention. He applied it now. He established a new routine with Rust, a silent patrol of the property line at dawn and again at dusk, the dog ranging ahead, nose down, reading the world at ground level, while Caleb read it from his greater height and lesser sensitivity. They moved through the early morning scrubland with a companionable efficiency that required no words and wasted no motion. Webb did not come back to the land. 3 weeks after the sabotage, Caleb was working the kiln when he heard boots on the eastern approach. He set down his tools and waited. He had learned in the weeks since Webb's visit to wait rather than to go. Men who came with legitimate business came to you. Men who came with other intentions preferred to find you moving. It was Webb. He stopped 10 feet away, hat in his hands, his eyes on the ground with the posture of a man who has had a conversation he didn't want to have and is now fulfilling obligations it created. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set, the weathered face of a man who had worked outside his whole life for returns that had consistently disappointed him. He had the particular expression of a man whose wife had spoken to him with precision on a subject he would have preferred to avoid. "I heard you had good bricks," Webb said, to the ground somewhere between them. "I do," Caleb said. A pause that had its own specific weight. "I need 2 dozen for the chimney." Caleb looked at him. Webb did not look up. 20 cents each, Caleb said. Twice what Pruitt was paying, not price gouging, but the market rate for direct purchase from the maker, and Webb knew it. Webb's jaw tightened a fraction. He nodded. 4 days, Caleb said. Collect from Pruitt's store. Webb put his hat back on, turned, and walked east without another word. Caleb watched him go and then turned back to the kiln. Some things did not need to be said. Some reckonings were settled in a currency that had no denomination, but was nonetheless specific and understood by both parties. Webb had come to buy bricks from the man whose clay pit he had ruined. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, exactly sufficient. He went back to work. The blizzard announced itself 3 days before it arrived, which was more warning than this kind of storm usually offered, and which Caleb took seriously because the sky was speaking a language he recognized from childhood, from the particular February when he was 12 years old, and the world went white for 5 days, and 3 of his father's cattle died, and the 4th only survived because his father brought it into the house, which had seemed insane at the time and had turned out to be precisely correct. The sky changed first, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of summer storms, but with a slow, deliberate shift in color that looked, to a trained eye, like the atmosphere preparing itself for something it had been building toward for a long time. The blue deepened and went flat and slightly greenish at the edges. The horizon to the northwest took on a bruised quality that was not quite clouds, but the leading edge of something massive moving from too far away to see clearly yet. The temperature dropped 6 degrees in a single afternoon and kept dropping through the night and into the next morning. He had 12 days of firewood stacked in the hollow. He went out and cut more, working the lower sections of the cottonwood that he hadn't yet touched, the dense old wood splitting reluctantly under the axe in chunks that would burn long and even. He set every snare on the new line and checked it twice a day for 2 days before the storm arrived, taking 3 rabbits and a grouse that he smoked over the fire pit using green juniper branches that he'd read once made a decent smoking wood and turned out to be approximately correct. He reinforced the canvas over the hollow entrance, lashing it at every corner and along the sides to the exposed cottonwood roots that flanked the opening, pulling it tight enough to resist pressure from outside. He banked additional clay along the lower sections of the wall where he'd felt drafts on cold nights, pressing it into the gaps with his fingers, working it smooth. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind came down from the mountains like something released rather than arrived. Not building, but sudden, full force from the first gust, the scrub oak thrashing and the junipers bending in a way that looked painful. Then the snow. It did not start gently. It arrived at full commitment, a driving horizontal wall of white that reduced the world beyond the hollow entrance to a uniform gray-white nothing within an hour of beginning. Caleb pulled the canvas tight and seated the wooden toggle he'd carved for exactly this purpose, and the sound of the blizzard became a muffled, continuous roar, like standing behind a waterfall of considerable size. He lit the fire. Russ pressed against his left leg and watched the canvas entrance with the focused attention of an animal that has assessed what's outside and made a clear decision about it. For 2 days, the hollow held without drama. The temperature inside dropped but did not become dangerous, measured by the unscientific but reliable method of how long he could hold his bare hand outside his coat before it stopped cooperating. The fire burned slow and steady, rationed with the discipline of a man who has calculated fuel against time and knows the margin. The stone walls did the work he had built them to do, absorbing the temperature change gradually, refusing to transmit the violence of the storm to the space behind them. 12 inches of packed earth on all exposed surfaces, the product of all those hauled canvas sacks, was functioning as insulation in a way that no above-ground timber structure in this county could have managed. He ate sparingly, hardtack and thin broth from dried meat and a small amount of the smoked rabbit. He rationed the water from the collection pit, which he had covered with a flat stone before the storm and which was cold but not frozen. The earth beneath it ran too deep to freeze fully, which was itself a piece of information he filed carefully. On the 3rd day, he heard something that had no place in his inventory of storm sounds. A groan, not the wind. He knew the wind by now in all its registers, the way you come to know the voice of any place you inhabit long enough. This was a structural sound, deep, wooden, the particular complaint of material under a load it was not certain it could carry indefinitely. The cottonwood trunk. He looked up at the underside of the wood that formed his ceiling, studying it the way a miner studies a roof after a shift in the rock. Not with fear, because fear closed your thinking, but with the open, calculating attention that was the difference between men who survived difficult situations and men who didn't. Snow was accumulating above. He couldn't see it, but he could calculate 3 days of heavy snowfall, compressing under its own weight, building across the full span of the trunk that was his ceiling. He worked the problem. The trunk was 8 feet of old cottonwood at its thickest, dried for years until it was as hard as any wood he'd handled. The span across the hollow was 12 feet. The heaviest load would bear on the eastern end, where the trunk rested on the root ball, not on the open chamber below. He was probably fine. He was not certain he was fine. And the difference between probably and certainly was the difference between sleeping and not sleeping, which was a practical problem. He cut 2 timber props from sections of straight deadwood he'd set aside months ago against exactly this kind of need. A miner's habit, keeping straight timber, because you never knew what kind of proof the ground would eventually require. He set them under the trunk at the 2 points where the grain showed the most stress. Not load-bearing in any engineered sense. Insurance. The kind that might matter or might not, but cost almost nothing to have in place. Then he sat with his back against the clay wall and kept the fire and listened to the storm and waited. On the 4th day, the groaning stopped. On the 5th morning, he woke to silence so complete it felt like a different category of experience from ordinary quiet. Not the muffled roar of the storm, not even the absence of it. Something deeper. The silence of a world that has been entirely covered and has temporarily stopped. He dressed in everything he owned, layered in the order that best preserved core temperature, and worked the canvas entrance loose from inside. It held flat against the opening, pressed by the weight of accumulated snow on the outside. He worked at it with the spade for 20 minutes, pushing and scraping, creating a gap large enough to work through on his belly, which was undignified but necessary, which described many of the most important things he had done in 61 years. He emerged into a world that had been replaced by another one. 4 feet of snow on level ground, deeper in the drifts against any vertical surface, the whole of it lit by a sun that had come back full force and was burning off a surface of white that reflected it doubled and then doubled again, a brightness so total and directional that it was nearly painful. He stood in waist-deep snow and turned slowly, reading what was left of the landscape under its new covering. The hollow behind him was invisible. The cottonwood trunk above it carried 2 feet of snow on its upper surface, and from outside there was no indication that anything lived beneath it. It looked like a fallen tree in a field of white. Nothing more. The kind of thing you rode past without looking twice. A man had survived 4 days of a killing blizzard in there, and the land had closed over him like water over a stone. He waded south and east, toward the point May's map had marked. The snow changed under his boots as he moved, shallower where rock ran close to the surface, the stone conducting enough residual ground heat to prevent full-depth accumulation. And then, in the low depression 40 yards southeast of the hollow, something that stopped him completely. A dark circle in the white, 6 feet across. The snow all around it was undisturbed, flat, continuous. But within the circle, it was gone. Melted from below, the ground exposed, dark and damp. Steam rising from the depression in thin curling threads that the cold morning air caught and dispersed before they reached any height. Caleb stood at the edge of it. He crouched down in the snow and put his hand into the depression at the center, pressing his palm against the ground. The water was cold, but not freezing. He could feel the gentle, upward pressure of it against his palm, steady and consistent, the faint warmth of deep earth carried to the surface by a force that had been building for a long time and had finally, under the weight of 4 days of compacting snow, found its way through. It was not dramatic. It was not a geyser. It was steady and quiet and persistent, which was exactly how May had been about everything she cared about. The blizzard's weight had done what May had calculated it eventually would. It had compressed the water table, increased the hydraulic pressure and forced open the channel she had identified. Years before, when she'd ridden this ground alone on a roan mare named Patience, while Caleb thought she was simply riding. Water, deep, don't let them tell you this land is nothing. Caleb sat beside his dead wife's spring in the snow and let the steam curl around him in the cold morning air and said nothing for a long time, because there was no one to say it to, and some things don't need to be said in words anyway. Then he stood up. He had 6 miles to walk to Duskwell for supplies, and the drifts would make it the effort of 8. His snares were all buried. His back had been expressing opinions since the 3rd day of the blizzard. His hands were cracked at 3 knuckles. He started walking. Duskwell after the blizzard looked like a town that had had an argument with something considerably larger than itself and was still deciding how badly it had lost. The livery roof had partially collapsed under snow load, not total, but requiring rebuilding, and in the meantime requiring the horses to be distributed among whoever had spare space. 3 smaller structures on the outskirts were damaged, one completely flattened, its walls splayed outward in the posture of a building that has stopped trying. 2 prospectors who had been camping in canvas on the eastern ridge had not come back and were not going to. Caleb walked through the damaged town to Pruitt's store, coated in snow to the waist, his beard carrying frost, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been in a bad situation underground for several days and has come back up into the light, still vertical. People looked at him, not the way they had looked at him before. The previous looking had been the sideways assessment of a town deciding what category he belonged in. The widow man, Virgil's inconvenient problem, the old miner on the worthless claim. This was different. This was the looking that a community does when something it believed has been revised by evidence. He pushed into Pruitt's store. Pruitt looked up from behind the counter. He took in the snow and the frost and the condition of Caleb's hands and said nothing for a full moment, which for Pruitt was equivalent to a lengthy response. Then he went to the back of the store and came back with a mug of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute that served in leaner times, and set it on the counter without explanation or ceremony. He did not charge for it. Caleb wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth move through his palms and up his arms and into the core of him where the cold had been sitting for 5 days. Spring came up and he said. Pruitt looked at him. May's water, the one on the map. The snow pushed it up. It's open ground now, running. Pruitt set both hands flat on the counter in the particular way of a man receiving information he had been, at some level, expecting and now needs a moment to integrate. He was quiet for a moment. Only open water source left in the county, he said. After this. Near enough, Caleb said. They looked at each other across the counter. That's going to attract attention, Pruitt said. I expect it will, Caleb said. He finished the coffee. He bought his supplies. Pruitt did not charge him the remote claim delivery surcharge he normally added and did not explain why. Caleb loaded his pack and walked out into the blinding white of the Colorado morning, the snow glittering with a particular extravagance of light on a surface that has never been walked on. He heard the door of the mercantile open behind him, heard boots on the boardwalk, which was unusual. Pruitt rarely left the store during business hours. Harrow. He stopped, turned. Pruitt stood in the doorway, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Man named Voss, Pruitt said. Colonel Harlan Voss, been buying water rights since October, everything east of the ridge. A pause measured in cold seconds. He's been asking questions about your land. Caleb held the older man's gaze for a moment. I expect he has, he said. He shouldered his pack and turned west. The spring was running in the dark under 4 feet of snow, steady and patient as May had been, as cold and persistent as the ground that had kept her secret for 8 years. Everything she had known was visible now to anyone who came looking. Let them come. He had dug his way to this. He was not moving. Voss arrived on a Tuesday. Caleb knew it was Tuesday because he had begun marking days on the inside wall of the hollow with a nail, a miner's habit from the deep shifts underground where the absence of natural light made time elastic and unreliable, and where knowing what day it was could matter in ways that were difficult to explain to someone who had never worked in the dark. He had started the marks the day he found May's box. He did not want to lose track of how long he had been here. It mattered. The length of it mattered. He was working the kiln when Russ stiffened beside him. The dog went from relaxed to fully alert in the instantaneous way of an animal whose threat assessment operated faster and more honestly than any instrument Caleb owned. He didn't bark, he simply stood, angled toward the eastern approach, and went completely still. 3 horses. Caleb heard them before he saw them, the particular sound of shod hooves moving carefully over uncertain ground, picking their footing through the patchy snow that still covered the north-facing slopes 2 weeks after the blizzard. He straightened from the kiln, set down his tools, and waited. They came over the ridge in a line, Voss in the center, flanked by 2 men who wore their purpose plainly in the way they sat and the way their hands rested near their coats. They were armed in the visible way, not threatening in any specific gesture, just present, the way certain things reminded you of other things without needing to be specific about it. Voss himself was something different from the men who flanked him. He was perhaps 65, straight-backed in the saddle with the posture of a man who had decided at some earlier point in his life that how he sat on a horse was a statement he intended to make consistently and had been making it ever since. He was well-dressed for the country, not ostentatiously, not in a way that suggested he didn't know what the country was, but precisely in the way a man dresses when he wants to communicate that he has never needed to worry about ruining good clothes. Silver at his temples, a close-trimmed beard, gray going white, the face of a man who had gotten what he wanted often enough that he had genuinely forgotten the specific feeling of not getting it. He dismounted with the ease of long practice and handed his reins to one of the flanking men without looking at him, which was its own communication about how he understood the world to be organized. He walked toward Caleb with his hands at his sides, his expression open and genuinely pleasant, the smile of a man who had been told he had good teeth and had been making intelligent use of the information for decades. "Mr. Harrow," he said. His voice carried the soft consonants of Virginia, or somewhere near it, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to rush his speech because the people he spoke to waited for him. "I've heard remarkable things." He stopped 6 feet away and looked around at what Caleb had built. The hollow entrance reinforced with stone and timber, the kiln, the clay pit visible to the south, the water channel running its clear line down the hillside, the low brick wall curving from the entrance to the stone surround of the spring. "What you've accomplished here," Voss said, with what sounded like genuine admiration, "is truly extraordinary. For a man on his own." He let those last 4 words sit in the cold air, comfortable with what they implied in the way of a man who understood how words did work when placed correctly. Russ was pressed against Caleb's left leg. Not growling, something quieter and more deliberate than growling. A vibration, a held potential, the precondition of an action not yet taken. "Colonel Voss," Caleb said. He did not offer his hand. He did not move from where he stood. Voss acknowledged the absence of the offered hand by not acknowledging it, which was a form of social competence. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, a deed form, deeds partially completed. "I want to make you a fair offer," Voss said. "More than fair. I know what this land has been assessed at, and I'm prepared to go considerably beyond that assessment." He named a number. It was a real number. More than the land had been worth by any standard assessment before the spring appeared. More than Caleb had made in his last 3 years of consulting work combined. It was the kind of number that, presented to most men in Caleb's situation, would have required serious consideration. It was also not the point. "I'm not selling," Caleb said. Voss lowered the document slightly. His expression did not change in any visible way, but something behind it adjusted, a subtle recalibration, the internal movement of a man shifting from his first approach to his second, which he had presumably prepared. "Mr. Harrow," he said, his voice still carrying the same pleasant, unhurried quality, "I want to be honest with you, because I respect what you've done here. I genuinely do." He gestured toward the spring. "That water is remarkable. In a dry year, and the dry years always come back, the old-timers in this territory will tell you that spring will be worth more than the land and everything on it combined. More than anything else in this county." He paused. "That kind of value draws attention, not only from me." "I expect it does," Caleb said. "A man alone out here." Voss glanced around at the scrubland, the distance to any neighboring structure, the absence of anyone in any direction who would witness anything. Springs can be contaminated. A dead animal upstream, and you'd never know the source until it was too late. Fences fail in hard weather. Accidents happen to men working alone in country like this. He met Caleb's eyes directly. The pleasant expression remained in place, unchanged, like a painting of a reasonable man applied over something that was not. It would be a genuine shame to see all this hard work come to nothing. The words settled into the cold air between them. Caleb looked at Voss for a long moment. He looked at the two flanking men on their horses, both watching with the professionally neutral attention of men paid to be present at the delivery of certain kinds of messages and to ensure those messages were received clearly. He felt the cold settle into the specific place behind his sternum, where in 40 years underground, fear had always lived. He knew that place well. He had made a working arrangement with it long ago, not the elimination of fear, which was neither possible nor desirable, but an understanding of what fear was for. Fear was information. It told you what was real. The mistake was letting it tell you what to decide. "This land is mine, Colonel Voss," Caleb said. The voice that came out was quiet and level. The voice he had used at depth when things were going wrong, and loudness would only consume oxygen that might be needed for other purposes. "My wife found it. She bought it. She surveyed it herself and found the water and kept the secret until someone deserved to know it. She's buried in the Methodist Cemetery in Duskwell, 6 rows from the east fence, and her name is on the deed alongside mine." He paused. "I'm not leaving." Voss held his gaze for a moment. The smile changed in the way that a temperature change is felt before it's measured, a slight tightening at the corners, a fraction of degree in the warmth behind it. "As you wish," he said. He turned, took his reins from the flanking man with the same easy inattention he'd used to hand them over, and mounted. He settled himself in the saddle and looked down at Caleb one final time. "I'm a patient man, Mr. Harrow," he said, not quite threatening, almost kind. "I generally arrive where I'm going." He turned his horse east and rode away. The two men fell in behind him, their horses' hooves cutting dark lines in the remaining snow. Caleb stood and watched them until they were gone from sight. Then he sat down on the low brick wall he'd built around the spring's opening and put his hands on his knees and breathed with deliberate slowness until his heart returned to something he would call acceptable. Russ put his chin on Caleb's knee. "I know," Caleb said. He worked through that night, not from fear. He had examined the fear and assigned it its correct function, which was to sharpen his thinking rather than direct his choices. He worked because the night after a man like Voss makes a visit is the right night to build what you intend to defend, while the reasons for defending it are still immediate and sharp. Using the bricks stockpiled from the last 3 kiln runs, 41 of them, stacked against the hollow's east wall, and the clay and limestone mortar he had refined through repetition into something consistent and reliable, he built outward from the existing wall, extending and raising it. Not a military fortification. Something older and more specific than that, a line drawn in the earth. In the cold dark, with a lantern hung from a cottonwood root above him, he set bricks by feel and by the small yellow circle of lamplight, building one course at a time. The mortar had to be worked quickly in the cold before it stiffened, and he had learned to mix it in small batches and work them fast. Each brick found its place in the course below with the gentle tap of the setting tool, the sound of something becoming permanent, the sound he had come to recognize as the specific music of this work. He worked until the eastern sky moved from black to gray to the pale, reluctant blue of a Colorado winter morning, arriving without enthusiasm. The wall was knee-high when he stopped, 40 feet of it, curving from the hollow entrance around and down to the stone surround of the spring. It would not stop men who were determined. That was not its purpose. Its purpose was to say, in a language older than any spoken one and more difficult to argue with, that this ground was occupied and maintained and understood by someone who knew how to make things that lasted. He stood back and looked at it in the early light. Russ sat beside him and regarded it with the attention he gave to things that smelled of consequence. "Not bad," Caleb said. He went inside and slept for 3 hours, which was all he allowed himself, and woke ready for the next thing. He went to see Pruitt that afternoon. He had not asked a man for help since May died. It was not stubbornness exactly, or not only stubbornness. Stubbornness was too simple a word for what it was. It was the understanding, developed over 61 years of being the kind of man he was, in the kind of world that existed, that asking for help was a transaction with a specific cost, and you did not pay that cost unless what you were protecting was worth more than your preference for handling things alone. May's spring was worth more. He walked into the mercantile as the afternoon light went amber through the west-facing windows. Long and thin, the particular light of winter afternoons that gave everything the quality of something about to be remembered. There were two other customers. He waited until they had finished. Some conversations needed the room to themselves. Pruitt looked at him from behind the counter with the expression of a man who has been expecting a particular conversation and has had time to be ready for it. Voss came out, Caleb said. I know, Pruitt said. Caleb looked at him. His man Decker was in here the day before, Pruitt said, asking about your claim, water rights, whether your deed was clean, whether there were any outstanding disputes or liens. He took off his spectacles and polished them on his apron with the slow deliberateness that Caleb had learned to recognize as Pruitt deciding something. I told him the deed was clean, that you were the sole legal owner with no outstanding claims or encumbrances, that the joint title reverted to you entirely on the death of your wife, which is what the law says and what the county recorder's records show. He put the spectacles back on. I also told him I had known May Harrow for 11 years and that she was the most careful woman I had ever seen handle a legal document. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Voss made threats, he said. Not direct, the kind dressed as concern. Pruitt nodded, having heard this genre of communication before. I need someone to write to the county land office, Caleb said, formally, confirming title and documenting the nature of the visit. A letter from me is a letter from an old man on a claim nobody believed was worth anything last month. A letter from you is a letter from a merchant who has been in this territory for 22 years and whose word the county recorder has relied on since before Voss had enough money to matter, Pruitt said. Yes, Caleb said. Pruitt opened the drawer beneath the counter and placed on its surface a sheet of writing paper, a pen, and an ink bottle, arranged with the efficiency of a man who had been ready to perform this action before he was asked to. Give me the date, Pruitt said, and the specific words he used, as close to exact as you remember them. Caleb told him, word for word, the way a miner remembered safety information, precisely without embellishment or softening, because inaccuracy in certain circumstances was its own kind of danger. Pruitt wrote, his handwriting was the careful copper plate of a man educated in a time when the quality of one's penmanship was considered a reflection of the quality of one's thinking. The letter was not long, 2 paragraphs, formal and specific, the language of a man who understood the difference between what could be established and what was only suspected. He sanded it, folded it, sealed it with wax. Mail rider tomorrow morning, Pruitt said. County seat has it by Friday. He slid it across the counter and then reached beneath the counter again and set a second item beside it. A small cloth-wrapped package placed without comment. Caleb unwrapped it. A box of cartridges. The correct caliber for May's Winchester. The rifle he had taken from the closet of the Alderman Street house because leaving it behind had felt like leaving part of her, and he had already left too much of her in too many places. Pruitt could not have known the caliber without having thought about it in advance. What do I owe you? Caleb asked. Nothing, Pruitt said. He looked back down at the papers on his counter with the decisive manner of a man returning to his proper work. Voss took 30 acres of my storage land in 1884, said it was back taxes. It wasn't back taxes. He did not look up. I have a long memory, Mr. Harrow. Caleb put the cartridges in his coat pocket. So do I, he said. Virgil came on a Thursday. Caleb was at the kiln, running his 3rd batch of the week. The rhythm of production had settled into something reliable now, 18 to 20 good bricks per run, and Pruitt was moving them faster than Caleb had expected, the demand driven partly by the blizzard's damage and partly by a growing reputation for brick that held. When he heard a horse on the eastern approach, he felt nothing in particular because rust did not stiffen. He looked up. The horse was a gray he didn't recognize. The man on it he recognized in the way you recognize someone you have known your entire life. Not feature by feature, but all at once. The complete impression arriving before any individual detail had been cataloged. Virgil had put on weight since September. His coat was new. He sat the horse with the slightly braced posture of a man who is not entirely at ease on horseback but has decided not to let that show. He dismounted and stood 20 feet from Caleb, hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and looked at what surrounded him. He looked at the hollow entrance with its framed doorway and brick threshold. He looked at the kiln, the clay pit to the south, the water channel, the stone surround of the spring, the 40-foot brick wall curving from the entrance. He looked at all of it for a long time, and Caleb watched him looking and understood precisely what was happening inside his brother's head. Because he had known Virgil Harrow for 49 years, and the man's calculations had never required any particular skill to read. The numbers were assembling themselves. The spring, the bricks, and the income they represented. The land that Voss had wanted badly enough to come out personally with 2 armed men and make specific threats. The offer price Voss had named. The distance between that number and the $20 Virgil had pressed into Caleb's hand on a Duskwell street in September. Virgil was doing arithmetic. "Caleb," he said, his voice was careful, layered with something meant to sound like warmth. "Virgil." A pause. The hat made another slow rotation. "You've done something remarkable here," he said. "I mean that sincerely." "What do you want?" Caleb said, not harshly, simply directly, the way you spoke underground when there wasn't enough air to spend on preamble. Virgil stopped turning the hat. He looked at Caleb directly for perhaps the first time since September, and the calculation in his eyes was briefly visible without its usual covering. "I've been hearing things," Virgil said, "about the water, about Voss." A pause. "I'm still family, Caleb. Whatever happened with the land, I was in a difficult position. The debts, the fees, things were more complicated than they appeared." "Come inside," Caleb said. Virgil blinked. He had come prepared for anger or refusal. The invitation confused him in a way that was interesting to observe. Caleb turned and walked into the hollow. After a moment, he heard Virgil's boots on the stone threshold behind him. Inside, Caleb lit the lantern and held it up so the light reached the walls. He watched his brother take in the space, the dimensions of it, the stone-lined walls, the chimney running up through the limestone with its clean draw, the pine bough bed replaced now by a proper frame he'd built from timber, the stacked and organized supplies, the tools hung along the east wall in the specific order of likely use that any miner would have recognized immediately. He watched Virgil look at the brick courses in the wall facing, the careful mortar joints, the way the stone floor had been leveled and smoothed. 40 feet of wall outside, Caleb said. 18 bricks per course, 2 full courses with a third underway. I have set 412 bricks since October. He paused. The kiln produces 20 good bricks per run. I run it 3 times a week. Pruitt sells them at 10 cents to the store trade, 20 to direct buyers. Last week he sold 31. He set the lantern on the flat stone that served as his table. The spring produces approximately 40 gallons per day in current conditions. In a dry year, based on the depth May calculated when she surveyed this land, it will produce more as surface water fails. It is the only water source in the county that did not freeze or diminish during the blizzard. It is the reason a man named Voss came here with 2 armed men and made specific threats about contamination and accidents. He reached into his coat and took out May's map. He unfolded it carefully on the flat stone, smoothing it with the back of his hand. Virgil looked at it. He recognized May's handwriting. You could not have lived in proximity to May Harrow for 30 years without knowing her hand the way you knew a familiar voice, and the recognition moved across his face in a way he couldn't fully control. "May found the water," Caleb said. "She surveyed this ground herself alone on the Sunday she told us she was just riding. She hired someone to verify what she'd found. Or she found it herself, I don't know which, and it doesn't matter. She buried this map here so the knowledge would survive regardless of what happened to the land. Regardless of what happened to her." He looked at his brother. "She didn't tell me because she knew I'd build a plan around it, and plans could be overheard. She trusted me to find it if I dug deep enough." He paused. "She didn't tell you because she understood you far better than you knew." Virgil said nothing. The hat had stopped moving entirely. "You sold this land for 4 times what you gave me," Caleb said. "I know the number. Pruitt knows the number. The men who bought it said it loudly enough in a public saloon that anyone within 20 feet heard every word. You didn't have debts. that couldn't wait. You had an opportunity, and you took it, and you handed me $20 and a story about taxes and rode away. He let that sit in the air between them for a moment. And then I walked out of Duskwell with $20 and a spade. I slept in a hole in the ground. I dug this place out by hand in clay that broke my skin every day for 3 weeks. I set snares in the dark. I ground limestone to powder with a river stone. I sat in a blizzard for 4 days, not knowing whether the roof above me was going to hold. I found May's water. I built this wall. I turned ground that every person in this territory told her was nothing into something that a man like Voss thinks is worth threatening an old man over. He folded May's map and put it back inside his coat, against his chest where it had rested since the second morning. There is nothing here that belongs to you, Virgil. Not one brick, not 1 inch of that wall, not one drop of that water, not 1 hour of what I have done here. He picked up the lantern. May's name is on the deed. Mine is on the deed. Yours has never been on this deed, and it never will be. Virgil stood in the hollow for a long moment. The calculation in his eyes had traveled somewhere else, replaced by something more complicated and considerably less comfortable. He was not a man without feeling. Caleb had never believed that about him, even now. He was a man who had allowed feeling to be consistently outweighed by convenience, which was a different kind of failure from cruelty, and not a more forgivable one, though perhaps a more common one. He put his hat on. He walked to the entrance and stopped with his back to Caleb, his hand on the doorframe that Daltrey had not yet built, the raw timber threshold that Caleb had set himself. She always thought more of you than she let on, Virgil said. His voice had changed. Something had been sat down in it. May, she always said you were the most stubborn man she'd ever known. And she said it the way people say things they mean as a compliment, even if it comes out sideways. Caleb said nothing. Virgil walked out. Caleb listened to the sound of the gray horse moving east, the hoofbeats diminishing through the scrubland in the clean, cold air, growing smaller and then ceasing to be audible. And then there was only the wind moving through the junipers and the quiet, persistent sound of the spring. He sat down with his back against the clay wall, in the hollow he had dug by hand and ground that had been called worthless by everyone who had ever looked at it, and he closed his eyes for a moment. He thought that May would have had something precise and dry to say about the entire sequence of events, delivered without satisfaction or sentimentality, because those were not the registers she operated in. He couldn't hear the specific words, but he could feel their shape somewhere in the vicinity of his chest, the same place the map rested. That was enough. That was, in fact, enough. They came 2 nights later. Caleb didn't know the exact time. Past midnight, the deep part of the night before the sky begins its preparatory lightning. What woke him was not a sound he had a name for immediately. He surfaced from sleep gradually, the way you surface when something has changed, but the change hasn't yet resolved into specific information. Then it resolved. Rust was barking. In all the months since the dog had come, through storms, through cold, through the visits of strangers, through the arrival of Voss's 3 horses, Rust had barked exactly once before. That had been the night the flood came in, when the water found its way under the canvas entrance, and Caleb had gone out into the driving rain and dug through the night to turn it. The dog had barked then, one sharp, sustained declaration, and Caleb had learned from it that Rust's silence was normal, and Rust's bark was emergency, and there was nothing between those 2 states. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, moving by the practiced reflex of a man who had spent decades being woken by dangerous sounds underground, and for whom the correct response to such sounds had become interior to thought. He pulled on his boots. He took May's Winchester from the wall where it hung, loaded, always loaded, the way May had kept it for 11 years in the Alderman Street closet, and the way Caleb had kept it here since the day he arrived. He moved to the entrance and pushed through the door and stood outside in the moonlit cold. 2 shapes at the far end of the brick wall, near the spring surround. They had tools, the dark lines of them visible against the white ground, crowbars or something similar. They had already worked loose 2 of the corner bricks from the coursework he had set by lantern light in a single cold night's work, and one of them was now working at the base course near the spring enclosure. Rust was standing 15 feet from the nearest man, barking with a focused, sustained intensity that had nothing theatrical about it. This was not a dog performing an alarm. This was a book doing the last thing available to him before the things that came next. Caleb walked from the hollow entrance to the center of the open space between the entrance and the spring. He stood there with May's Winchester held across his body, not raised, not aimed, present. He said nothing. He simply stood in the moonlight and waited for the two men to become aware of him in the gradual way of men absorbed in work who realize they are no longer alone. The nearer man saw him first. He straightened. He said something quiet to the other man, who straightened as well. They looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at them. Russ stopped barking. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the spring water moving through the stone channel Caleb had cut, finding its patient course across the cold ground toward the collection pit, doing what it had been doing since the blizzard opened it and would continue doing long after whatever happened here tonight was over. The two men looked at each other. They looked at the Winchester. They looked at Rust, who had settled into the low forward posture of an animal who has communicated everything he intends to communicate and is now waiting to see what the human beings decide to do. The two men picked up their crowbars. They walked east. Caleb watched them until they were gone from sight, which took longer than it might have because the moonlight on the snow made the distance uncertain, and his eyes kept following the dark shapes longer than they were actually visible. Then he walked to the spring's surround and examined the damage in the moonlight. Two corner bricks worked loose, one cracked at the base along its longest axis. 3 hours of repair work in the morning. He had the bricks, 3 full runs worth stacked against the east wall. He had the mortar materials. He had repaired worse. He went back inside. He set the Winchester on the flat stone beside the lantern. Russ came in, pressed briefly against Caleb's leg in the particular way he had of making contact without requesting anything, and then walked to his place near the banked fire and lay down with the decisive finality of an animal whose professional obligations for the evening were concluded. Caleb rebuilt the fire from the coals and sat with his back against the wall and watched the flames establish themselves and waited for morning. He was not particularly interested in sleep, and sleep was not particularly interested in him, and so they reached an accommodation that involved him sitting quietly and the fire doing what fires do, and the spring doing what it did, and the land lying still and dark in every direction under the stars that May had made a habit of watching at the end of every day. He thought, it holds. He thought, it held through the blizzard, and it held through the flood, and it held through Voss, and it held through Virgil, and it held through tonight. He thought, May knew it would. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived for him at Pruitt's store. Pruitt handed it over without comment, which was its own form of communication. Caleb opened it at the counter. It was from the county land office, the formal copperplate of a government clerk, precise and impersonal. It acknowledged receipt of the letter from Cormac Pruitt, proprietor, Pruitt's Mercantile, Duskwell, Colorado. It confirmed the validity of the Harrow deed, dead, sole title, the joint tenancy having reverted entirely to Caleb Harrow upon the death of May Harrow in October 1885, unencumbered by any subsequent transaction or claim. It noted that the office had received an inquiry from the legal representative of Colonel H. Voss regarding water rights on the parcel, and that based on the deed and the nature of the water source, a natural spring arising from below the established property boundary. The water rights were held in their entirety by the deed holder and were not separable from the land title without that holder's written consent. In the margin, in different ink and a less formal hand, a sentence had been added. Someone at the county office who knew enough about Voss to have opinions. Any further interference with the above-named property or its owner should be reported immediately to this office. Caleb folded the letter carefully and put it inside his coat. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked back, his expression offering nothing in particular and meaning something precise. Caleb nodded once. He did not hear from Voss again. Spring arrived the way it always arrived in the Colorado high country, not as a declaration, but as an argument with itself. Warm days surrendering to hard frosts and then reclaiming the ground, the light increasing daily by amounts too small to track, but too significant to miss. The scrubland greening in the hesitant incremental way of a landscape that had been burned before and wasn't sure yet whether to trust the warmth. Caleb expanded the hollow by 6 feet to the south, which gave him a second chamber, connected to the first by a low doorway he framed with timber and lined with a course of brick. He built proper floors in both chambers using flat limestone slabs selected for their flatness and set in clay mortar, leveled with a long, straight piece of timber used as a guide, then ground smooth with a river stone until they were even enough to walk without catching a heel. He had learned patience in the leveling. The first attempt had taken 2 days and come out almost right, and almost right was not right. So he pulled it up and did it again. And the second attempt took 3 days and came out right. He rebuilt the section of wall Voss's men had damaged, matching the coursework to the existing section so precisely that the repair was invisible to anyone who hadn't been told where to look. Then he extended the wall another 20 feet south, completing the enclosure around the spring. Within the enclosure, he planted shoots taken from the willows along the creek bottom 3 miles south. They would grow fast, root deep, stabilize the soil around the spring surround, and in a few years would make the enclosed space feel like something planned rather than defended. Pruitt sent Daltrey out in early April. He was perhaps 30, a carpenter by training, arrived on foot with his tools and a canvas roll over one shoulder and a letter from Pruitt in his coat pocket, with the particular endorsement of a man who chose his words with care. He is a good worker and he is not a fool, which I have found to be a rarer combination than logic would suggest. Daltrey spent his first hour at the property simply looking. He walked the perimeter of what Caleb had built, examined the kiln, crouched at the brick wall, and ran his thumb along the mortar joints, bent close to the spring surround, looked up at the cottonwood trunk and its relationship to the hollow beneath it. "Who taught you the mortar formula?" he asked. "Nobody," Caleb said. "I worked it out." Daltrey was quiet for a moment. "The limestone compound in it, I've never seen that done. Does it hold?" Daltrey pressed his thumbnail into the joint between two bricks and felt nothing give. "Yes," he said, "better than what I was taught to use." They spent 2 weeks working together, and the exchange was genuinely bilateral. Not a teacher and a student, but two men with different knowledge going in both directions. Caleb showed Daltrey the clay deposit in the kiln process, the ratio of limestone powder to clay that he had arrived at through 7 batches of failure and 6 of success, the firing temperature he had learned to control through careful management of fuel load and vent gap, the cooling protocol that prevented the thermal shock cracking that had cost him 3 full batches before he understood what was happening. Daltrey absorbed it all with the attention of a man who understood he was being given something that had been arrived at through real cost. In return, Daltrey built a proper door frame for the hollow entrance, mortised and tenoned in white oak, the joints cut with a precision that Caleb watched with the appreciation of a man who recognized skill in the doing of a thing rather than only in its result. He hung it on iron hinges he had brought from town, set perfectly level, the door swinging open and closed on its own weight with a soft mechanical certainty. The first night Caleb pulled that door closed against the April cold and heard it settle into its frame without a gap, he sat with his back against the wall and felt the completeness of it. The hollow was sealed now in a way it had not been before. Not a hole in the ground, not a dugout, not a place you endured. A room, a home. May would have said something. He couldn't hear what exactly, but he could feel the shape of it. Dry, affectionate, exact. Somewhere in the vicinity of his chest, which was where he had kept her since October of 1885, and where he expected to keep her for whatever time remained. Leora Adwell came in May. She was perhaps 55, arrived on a mule she rode with the practical efficiency of a woman for whom a mule was a tool rather than a statement. She wore working clothes and an expression of determined matter-of-factness that reminded Caleb, in its architecture, if not its specific details, of May. Not in appearance, but in the quality of attention she brought to what was in front of her, the absence of any performance of need or distress. She had a small claim 12 miles southwest, the kind of land that required constant resourcefulness to make productive. Her husband had died of influenza 2 winters before. She had heard about the bricks from a neighbor who had bought from Pruitt. She had ridden 12 miles to ask 2 things. The first was whether she could buy bricks on credit against the sale of her winter wheat, payment in the spring. The second was whether Caleb could tell her what was wrong with her drainage. Water pooled against her foundation every significant rain, and she had tried 3 different approaches to fixing it, and none of them had worked. Caleb looked at her. She looked back with the level, patient directness of a woman who had stopped having time for anything that wasn't specific and useful. He explained the drainage. He drew it in the dirt, the principle of grade and how much of it was required, the minimum slope for reliable flow in different soil types, the relationship between permeability and the placement of collection channels. She asked precise questions. He answered them precisely. It took perhaps 20 minutes and neither of them wasted any of it. When they were done, she said, "The bricks. 2 dozen ready in 10 days, he said. Payment in spring is acceptable." She nodded once, mounted the mule. "One more thing," she said from the saddle. He waited. "Pruitt says you're the only person in the county who really understands this clay." She looked at the kiln, the wall, the hollow entrance, and its proper door. "He's probably right. You should be charging more." She turned the mule south and rode away without looking back, which was the manner of a person who had said what she came to say and considered the conversation complete. Caleb stood and watched her go. Then he looked at his kiln and his wall and his spring and the door that Daltrey had hung with such precision, and he thought she was probably correct about the pricing, and he made a mental adjustment that he would apply beginning with the next order. He went back to work. On an evening in late May, he sat at the entrance of the hollow as the sun went down. The Colorado sky performed its nightly sequence with the unhurried thoroughness of a process that had been occurring long before anyone was watching and would continue long after. The blue deepening through stages he had been cataloging since winter, each stage distinct, each containing information. The whole thing conducting itself with the calm authority of something that needed no audience to proceed correctly. The scrubland below the ridge was green now in the tentative way of high country spring, the pinon and juniper putting out new growth that caught the last of the light in small, bright points across the hillside. The spring ran its quiet course through the stone channel, finding the collection pit, doing what it had been doing since the blizzard opened it. Rust was beside him, chin on paws, watching the middle distance with the peaceful attention of an animal that has concluded it is in the correct place and has no further questions about the matter. Caleb had a coffee, real coffee, bought at Pruitt's store with money made from the clay of this land, shaped and fired by his own hands, and sold through Pruitt's counter to people who needed what he had learned to make. He held the tin cup in both hands and felt its warmth and looked out over what May had seen from the back of a roan mare on a Sunday afternoon 8 or 9 years ago. 300 acres of rock and scrub, and underneath it, water. The hollow behind him was real now, in a way it had not been that first cold night when he'd slid down into it and pressed his palm against the clay wall and thought, this can work. 2 chambers, stone floors, a proper door on proper hinges, a chimney that drew clean through the limestone fissure, walls that held heat through the coldest nights, a spring enclosed in brick, a kiln that had produced, by his count on the nail marks inside, 1,147 bricks since October. 4 of those bricks were in fireboxes in Duskwell. 38 had gone into Webb's chimney, paid for at 20 cents each by a man who had come with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, which was its own form of accounting. Daltrey had taken 112 as partial payment for the door to use in a small project of his own that he said he would tell Caleb about when it was finished. The letter from the county land office was folded in May's cedar box, sitting on the stone table inside next to the lantern. The cedar box that had traveled from the Alderman Street house in Caleb's pack on the morning he left before dawn, because there were things you did not leave behind. Voss had not come back. Perhaps the county letter had been sufficient. Perhaps he had found other water, or other land, or other men whose resolve was more negotiable than Caleb's had turned out to be. It didn't matter. The spring ran regardless of Voss's plans. The land held regardless of what Voss intended. May had known that good ground didn't require the permission of powerful men to be good ground, and she had been right. And Caleb had spent the better part of a year learning what she had known in an afternoon on horseback. Virgil had not come back either. That one was more complicated. Caleb had spent time with it, the way he spent time with things that didn't resolve cleanly, not trying to force a shape onto it that it didn't naturally take, but turning it over, looking at it from different angles, letting it be what it was rather than what he would have preferred it to be. Virgil was his brother. That was a geological fact, unchangeable by opinion or preference, like the limestone shelf above his fire pit. It was what it was regardless of how he felt about it. What Virgil had done was also a geological fact. Those two facts did not resolve each other. They coexisted, the way difficult realities always coexisted, which was the same as anywhere else but closer. He would not pursue Virgil. He would not attempt reconciliation, because reconciliation required a foundation of honesty that Virgil had not yet demonstrated any interest in providing. If Virgil came back with something true to say, Caleb would listen. If Virgil came back with another calculation dressed in the clothes of sincerity, Caleb would show him the door that Daltrey had built and built well. That was as far as he could take it, and he had decided it was far enough for now, and now was the only time he was living in. He looked out at the spring. May had come here alone on a horse she called Patience, and she had walked this ground and read it the way she read everything, completely, carefully, without sharing what she found until she was certain of it. She had buried the map in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth under the only tree on the property you couldn't miss, and she had addressed the note inside not to him, but to whoever digs here. He had thought about that in the months since. He had thought about it on quiet evenings like this one, sitting at the entrance of the hollow with the sky performing its sequence above him and the spring running below him and the land lying still in every direction. She had not written his name. She had written for the day someone digs here. He thought he understood it now, or understood it better than he had when he first read it, sitting in the hollow with his bleeding hands and the coals of the previous night's fire still giving off their last warmth. She had not known who would dig. She had not known if she would outlive the land question, if Caleb would outlive it, if anyone they knew would be the one to find what she had left. She had known that whoever dug deeply enough in this ground would be the person who had earned the right to find what was there, not by inheritance or legal claim or the luck of proximity, but by the specific act of digging, of choosing the ground over the easier options, of going back when they could have gone somewhere else. She had trusted the ground to make the determination. She had trusted that the earth kept its promises in a way that people, even people you loved, sometimes did not. He had been the one who dug. He was still here. Russ lifted his head, looked at the darkening sky with the brief attention of an animal noting that one phase of the day was ending and another was beginning, and set his chin back on his paws. The sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the sky began its final movement, the orange giving way to red, giving way to the deep purple that preceded the blue-black of a clear Colorado night. The first stars appearing one at a time in the east, the way certain truths appear, not all at once, but in sequence, each one becoming visible only after you've had time to adjust to the one before it. The light from inside the hollow spilled out through the doorway that Daltrey had built, the warm yellow of the lantern falling across the brick threshold, across the stone entrance, across the wall curving toward the spring, across the dark ground of 300 acres that had been called worthless by every person who had ever assessed it before May. Caleb Harrow, 61 years old, with limestone dust worked permanently into the creases of his hands and calluses on his palms that had their own topography, and a dog of uncertain origin asleep beside him, and a spring running in the dark 40 yards away, and 1,100 bricks to his name, and a dead woman's faith folded against his chest next to his heart, sat at the entrance of the home he had built and watched the stars come out one at a time over his land. He had not smiled much since May died. He did not smile now, but something in him that had been held very tight for a very long time had released. Gradually, without announcement, the way certain shifts happened underground, not sudden collapse, but slow settling, the earth finding a new equilibrium after a long period of strain, like a timber prop that is no longer needed, light ground that has finally settled and will not shift again. He had come back to this ground with $20 and a spade and a dead woman's word that it was worth something. The ground had given him everything it had. He had kept his word. That was enough. That had always been enough.